Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. What is the R2P, the Responsibility to Protect concept? Today we're going to get an update on this very important international concept. My guest today is an expert. Dr. Simon Adams is Executive Director of the Global Center for the Responsibility to Protect. Between 1994 and 2002, Dr. Adams worked with Sinn Féin and former IRA prisoners in support of the Northern Ireland peace process. He is also a former anti-apartheid activist and member of the African National Congress. Dr. Simon Adams, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Thanks, Bill, and it's great to be back on your show.
Yes, right. We did this about 4, 5, 6 years ago, maybe something like that. Right. Well, welcome back.
Thank you very much.
You're dealing with a very important concept, very important, well, really important projects around the world. But what is the Global Center or Global Center for Responsibility to Protect? What do you do? What is your main mission?
Well, I guess our main mission is to, on the one hand, raise awareness around this concept of the responsibility to protect, this idea that was adopted by the UN at the World Summit in 2005 and endorsed by all the heads of state in the world, and which basically says, that we have a responsibility as human beings to one another, and that the UN member states, all 193 of them, have a responsibility to not only prevent genocide and war crimes and crimes against humanity in their own countries, but also to work together to prevent and to halt them anywhere where they may happen in the world. So my organization is really to promote that concept, but also is to work on those country situations where there's either a threat of atrocities or where atrocities are happening, I should say, and to try and work with the UN Security Council and try to work with the Human Rights Council to make sure that there's a timely and hopefully decisive response whenever there's a threat of mass atrocities to anybody in the world.
Now, the United Nations set you up in 2005, but you're outside of the United Nations. You're a separate entity that member states support you financially, and so you have your own board of directors, but you still interact with the UN in many levels.
Yeah, we're an independent NGO. We were set up by a number, I guess, of the personalities who were involved in developing these ideas, not least of all the late Kofi Annan and people like Gareth Evans and Desmond Tutu and Mary Robinson and Jan Eliasson, the former Deputy Secretary General here, and many other people. But we were set up as an independent, non-governmental organization. But we kind of play a weird, I guess, insider-outsider role in that even though we're officially outside of the UN, we work very closely with the, as I said, the UN Security Council, and do advocacy with member states around all of these issues.
Now, you were set up in 2005. So I think back, we saw the horrific genocide that took place in Rwanda between the Hutus and the Tutsis in the mid-90s, the Balkan crisis later in the 90s. Were those some of the major issues that prompted the UN General Assembly to say, never again, we need some type of organization to monitor and to be involved in helping to short-circuit some of these tensions and potential conflicts?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think the slogan "Never Again" goes back to the end of the Second World War, of course, but I think the history of the 20th century was quite obviously a case of again and again and again, rather than actually never again. And I think there's probably been no issue in the history of the United Nations which has done more to tarnish and damage its reputation than the failure to prevent or halt atrocities in the world. But I think it probably wasn't really until Rwanda and then to Srebrenica in Bosnia the following year in 94 and 95 that the UN started to really fundamentally grapple with these issues. And I think without the kind of the reckoning that takes place in the aftermath of genocide in Rwanda and Srebrenica, R2P emerges as a concept saying, okay, sure, we can't fix everything that's broken in the world, but surely there are some things that are so fundamental to us as human beings that we have to stop them from happening.
So often we hear these terms that are being used like genocide and what have you. Let's, for folks such as myself who may not have a real clear idea, do you have a brief definition and maybe an example for each one like genocide? How would you define that?
Yeah, I mean, I think genocide, obviously, the classic case from which we get the word genocide is, of course, the Nazi Holocaust against the Jews. But I think sometimes what happens in the world of politics is people get very hung up on these terms. Is it a genocide? Is it crimes against humanity? Is it war crimes? These are legal concepts which are defined in the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, which are defined through more than half a century of international law. And I think what we say is that ultimately it's up to a court to determine, whether that be a domestic court or an international tribunal, what one of the specific crimes has happened, but that in each of these cases what we can see are what we would call mass atrocity crimes, that it is one of these types of crimes directed against innocent and vulnerable populations, not for anything that they've done, but for who they are because of their identity. And so I guess if you were looking at recent examples, I certainly think that the fact-finding mission on Myanmar has pointed out that what happened to the Rohingya minority in northern Rakhine State in late 2017 was a case of genocide. We see crimes against humanity and war crimes ongoing every day in Syria at the moment. And I think those are just a couple of examples of very bad things that are happening in the world and which the international community should be doing more to stop. But I think we as an organization are also very focused on countries that are struggling to uphold their responsibilities and where there's still time to prevent rather than to deal with the horrible reality of crimes that are occurring right now.
There's another term, ethnic cleansing. How would you define that?
Well, ethnic cleansing is a very interesting concept, actually, because it's actually a term that comes from perpetrators themselves. It was actually used during the Yugoslav wars by perpetrators to describe what they thought they were doing. We're going to ethnically cleanse this area. And then, of course, in the aftermath of the wars in the former Yugoslavia, it becomes a particular kind of term to describe the attempt to inflict violence on a community because of their ethnicity and to force them to flee as a result. I mean, of the terms that you mentioned, of genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, ethnic cleansing is not actually defined clearly in international law, but I guess would be a subcategory of crimes against humanity.
Before I forget it, we want to put out your website, www.globalr2p.org. That's r2p.org, so our viewers can go and pick up more information on what we're talking about. Well, you had mentioned a variety of sites and atrocities that have taken place and are taking place today. Why don't we take a look at them and get an update on each? Let's just go to Syria. What is the latest on Syria? We have seen crimes against humanity, war crimes, just on steroids in that particular country. It's such a tragedy. What are you doing there to try to help? I know you can't do it by yourself, but what is your work there, and what is the latest as far as looking at the status of that crisis?
Yeah, I mean, I think probably there's no crisis in the world today that's caused greater amount of human suffering and it appears more intractable than the Syrian crisis. And I think the thing that's so terrible about that is it did not have to be this way. We've now have, more than 500,000 dead in Syria, millions upon millions of refugees, millions of people displaced. And we've seen over the course of the last 8 years, of course, when that issue has been dealt with at the UN Security Council, we've had 12 vetoes by either Russia and China together or by Russia alone, blocking international action and stopping the UN and the international community from upholding its responsibility to protect the Syrian people. And as a result, I think we have this catastrophic crisis and now this proxy civil war, which just seems to defy our understanding of how low human beings can sink in terms of their willingness to inflict suffering on their fellow human beings. So I think that it's certainly a very terrible time in Syria, but it's never too late for the international community to make a difference. And I think right now there's the crisis in Idlib, in the north of the country, where Russia and the Syrian government are bombing that part of the country. And the international community needs to do more to help people on the ground there.
And you mentioned how there was a stalemate, or there were loggerheads in the UN Security Council between Russia and the other 4 permanent members, or maybe China may have been with Russia. I can't remember. But anyway, so often while that was going on, there were UN agencies on the ground, the World Food Program, the UN Children's Fund, helping with maternal child health care programs, the High Commission for Refugees, Refugee Assistance. They were on the ground helping Syrians every day and to try to keep them alive and get them out of harm's way while all the wrangling went on in New York at the Security Council.
And by the way, often getting bombed and shot at for their troubles as well.
And killed.
Yeah,
that's exactly
absolutely.
Right. That's very, very true. Well, let's look at another tragedy. It's just every day it gets worse and worse, is Yemen. What's the latest there?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think this is one of these situations where we've seen since 2011 so much go wrong in the situation in Yemen. There was, of course, a transition from a dictatorship to hopefully what people thought might be a new form of government. Then a civil war broke out, of course, and we've had this international intervention since 2015, led by, of course, Saudi Arabia and by the United Arab Emirates, which has greatly exacerbated both the war and the humanitarian crisis in that country. So I think as a proportion of the population, Yemen is now the greatest humanitarian crisis in the world. But I think what we should have learned over the last years of this war is that there is no military solution in Yemen, and that there's only going to be a negotiated way out of this conflict, and that protagonists on both sides of that conflict are perpetrating war crimes. The greatest amount of those war crimes are a result of airstrikes by the international coalition, but there are war crimes on both sides, and that there not only needs to be an end to this war, there actually also needs to be accountability for those who have committed war crimes against civilian populations.
Now, you don't have a large staff, but you still obviously have operatives in Yemen. What are they doing to try to deal with this tragedy and help to defuse it, and to talk, as you're talking, to have a political settlement? Because a military settlement is not going to happen, and who knows when it's going to stop if they keep pushing for that.
Yeah, I mean, we mainly work with partners in a number of these countries, and often when you're talking about active war zones, that's very, very difficult, whether you're talking about Syria or whether you're talking about Yemen. But I think one of the most extraordinary things about the world in which we live is that, you know, everywhere where there is war, conflict, injustice, persecution, there are also people fighting back against those circumstances. So there are human rights defenders on the ground right now in Idlib in northern Syria, and there's also people on the ground in Yemen who are documenting what's happening, who are working to protect people and help people in all kinds of ordinary ways, and also to alert the rest of the world about what's going on. And yeah, we're lucky enough to work with some of those people who are operating in the worst and most dangerous situations you can possibly imagine.
Well, you're watching Global Connections program, which is a privately funded, independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guest. We would invite our viewers to go to our website at www.globalconnectionstelevision.com to view previous programs. Also, if you're involved with any type of PBS or community access television station, or you have an educational institution that you're involved with that has an intra-campus television hookup, or you just have a computer, you have a website, and you like our programs and you'd like to share them with other people, please feel free to do so. Global Connections Television is provided at no cost as a public service to help us better understand international issues and how they impact our lives. Today we're talking about the responsibility to protect and what can be done to help people who are very vulnerable, who are involved in some type of genocide or crimes against humanity or war crimes or ethnic cleansing. My guest today is an expert in this area. My guest is Dr. Simon Adams, who is the Executive Director of the Global Center for the Responsibility to Protect. Simon, we've been jumping around the world a bit.
Sure.
One country where it was vicious, and a lot of people believe that the invasion in 2003, which is widely viewed now as the illegal invasion of Iraq in 2003, started this whole domino effect in many areas in the Middle East. What is the status of Iraq right now? We don't read very much about it. We hear little bits and pieces. What is happening there?
Yeah, I mean, I think well, that's a long answer I could give you, going all the way from, you know, my opinion about that illegal invasion in 2003 to the current situation in the country. Maybe the shorter version is to say, you know, that I think this is a country that is still struggling to recover from atrocities that were committed by ISIS, ISIL, however you want to refer to them, who of course swept across the Nineveh plain in 2014 in the middle of the year. It's actually the 5th year anniversary this Saturday of the beginning of the genocide against the Yazidi population in the north of the country. That's this weekend is the anniversary of that. And I think the country is still recovering from the terrible atrocities, you know, perpetrated by ISIS. And I think there's still very much to be done, both by the international community and by the Iraqi government, to deal with that. So, for example, it's extraordinary to me, as somebody who's worked quite closely with Yazidi survivors, including Nadia Murad, who, of course, we saw win the Nobel Peace Prize last year, that despite everything that's happened, not a single ISIS member has ever been held accountable in a court of law for genocide, war crimes, or crimes against humanity perpetrated in Iraq against the Yazidi population or against any other minority population in that country. They've been held accountable for terrorism. They've been hanged, after rudimentary trials. But we think it's very, very important for the Iraqi government to work with international partners to have some kind of an international tribunal to hold these perpetrators accountable in front of their victims, survivors, and the eyes of the world.
Has it just been because of the lack of political will to do it, or why have they not been tried or not been found guilty in this particular venue of the court?
I think it's been a difficult issue for Iraq. I mean, there's a number of, without getting too deep in the weeds, they don't have domestic laws around genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. And they need, we believe, to incorporate that into domestic law through enabling legislation. But I think also it's no surprise to say that there's a tremendous amount of bitterness about what ISIS did to people in Iraq. And there's definitely a sense, I guess, of the need to hold them accountable, but to hold them accountable as terrorists and to punish them as quickly as possible, whereas we would like to see something more transparent, and we think internationally credible, and which is also victim-focused rather than just being purely about retribution.
Another area we were reading a lot about a year or 2 years ago about South Sudan. Now we're reading more about Sudan as opposed to South Sudan.
Yeah.
What is the latest as far as those two particular countries?
Sure. I mean, South Sudan, of course, has come out of this very dreadful civil war, and I think things are far from fixed in South Sudan, but certainly as compared to the peak of the conflict a few years ago, where we now think up to somewhere in the vicinity of about 300,000 people were killed during the civil war that started in December 2013 until finally a peace agreement in 2018. Things have certainly improved a lot in South Sudan, and ironically we've seen the situation now in Sudan, and particularly very tragic events this week where, of course, the Transitional Military Council, which rules Sudan after taking power in a coup in April, shot dead 4 school children this week who were protesting. We saw an earlier massacre on the 3rd of June of about 120 unarmed civilians in the middle of Khartoum, again by people acting on behalf of the Transitional Military Council. So we think, again, that is a situation where the international community needs to put all the pressure it possibly can upon the military in Sudan and upon their important international allies, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, to make sure that we stop Sudan slipping further into the abyss.
Another country that's starting to get more attention is Cameroon.
Yeah.
What's causing the problems in Cameroon, and what is the status of that particular situation?
Yeah, I mean, Cameroon is again, for me, a very deeply disturbing situation that started out of identity-based conflicts. You have an Anglophone, that is to say an English-speaking minority who are mainly concentrated in one part of the country, and a mainly Francophone-dominated government. People protested against the long sense of marginalization that they felt. And unfortunately, that the government's response was bullets and batons that then encouraged, I think, separatist tendencies amongst the Anglophone population. And we now have this armed conflict in the Anglophone areas, which has actually displaced somewhere in the vicinity of about 500,000 people. There are literally hundreds of schools which have been shut down or burnt down or destroyed. We actually don't know how many people have been killed because it's very hard to track civilian deaths in Cameroon. And this developing armed conflict, which no one in Cameroon will benefit from or prosper from. And I think one of the sad things is that now is the time for the international community and for the UN Security Council upstairs in this building to actually get engaged in the issue of Cameroon. And that's just not happening.
And one of the ones that's been with us since 1948 really has been Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories.
Yeah.
What is it? That seems to go on. It festers more and more. It seems we're further away from an agreement than we were maybe 2 years ago, something like that. What's the latest in that particular area of the world?
Well, what I can say is from our point of view is that I think that you know, in the world of politics, I think there's a tendency to try and force people to make a binary decision. You're either for the Israelis or you're for the Palestinians. And what I always say in answer to whenever anybody asks me that is, I'm actually for neither. I'm for the human rights of ordinary people who live in both Israel and in the occupied Palestinian territories. I am not for Hamas firing rockets indiscriminately into Israel. That is a war crime. But it is also a war crime for Israel to use its overwhelming military force to bomb the Gaza Strip, to enforce an illegal blockade against an entire civilian population, or to use unnecessary and deadly force against unarmed protesters on the border between Gaza and Israel. So I think until the international community is able to look at the Israel-Palestinian question purely from a human rights point of view, and purely from the point of view of trying to find a just and equitable solution for both groups of people, then unfortunately I think we're going to be in these political partisan trenches.
We're going to be in the quagmire, the quicksand for years to come. There's been a lot of talk about having no longer a two-state solution, whereas you have the Palestinians with their state and the Israelis with theirs. They're talking about a single state. Is that feasible? Is that actually feasible of doing it without creating some type of an apartheid situation in that, if it were to happen and be like just one state? And can that preserve the Jewish character of a state? It seems like those two issues are just that they fly in the face of each other.
Yeah, and again, I'm not an expert on that particular country. I have staff who work on those things. Yes. But certainly there is, about all these kinds of proposed solutions, there is much that deeply worries me. It worries me that we have basically recurring conflict, that just seems to be escalating each time it happens. The wars get worse and they just keep happening between, Hamas and Israel. But also that the underlying situation just seems to continually fester. And I think the solutions that are proposed, whether that's just, illegally annexing the entire West Bank, or somehow, blocking off Gaza permanently, or incorporating Palestinians as kind of third-class citizens into an Israeli state, none of these seem like either lasting, objectively like lasting, solutions to the problem, but also as a human rights person, as somebody who works on R2P, these are things which we would see as significant risk factors for future conflict and for potential atrocities.
Well, you've gone through a whole list of intractable problems, and hopefully they will get better as we move along. And of course, it's going to take the involvement of everyone, but especially the Security Council and the whole UN system, and maybe all 193 members of the General Assembly. In the last 30 seconds we have left, what do you see as your major challenge as you move forward in dealing with many of these intractable situations?
Yeah, look, I think we're living in some ways dark times. I think that people feel that. They feel that instinctively. They feel that human rights is under attack in many parts of the world, including in the United States of America, where this show is being taped right now. But I think if you look at the world, we currently have 70.8 million people in the world displaced by persecution, by conflict, and by mass atrocities. That's the highest number at any time since the Second World War. And so the question is, how are we going to respond to that? Are we just going to accept that as a natural state of affairs, or are we going to defend the principles and defend the rights that have been built up over the last half century, and of which the responsibility to protect is just one principle from that entire kind of raft of humanitarian law and of human rights principles. And I think, when I look at the world and I look at the things that I've seen in my own lifetime, but even in the last 8 years that I've been working in my current job, I've seen where international action can make a difference, where we can prevent these terrible things from happening. And I think we just need to do that. Wherever there is a threat of the mass grave or the machete or whatever, we need to stop it from happening.
Exactly. Well, Dr. Simon Adams, this is an extremely important topic, and I wish you very much luck in the future, because these issues do need to be dealt with as quickly as possible. But I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us today on Global Connections Television.